So, hello everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion. My name is Kathleen Clancy from the German Academic Exchange Service. I am joined by our esteemed panelists. We are a panel of 6, I hope. You see there's one chair empty here, so because we've actually had Udbhav Tiwari and Koen Nomden, who maybe they could join us virtually. I hope they're there. Sadly not be able to join us on very short notice. But I thought I'd leave the chair empty. If anybody thinks that they have something to add to the discussion, we have a microphone. You can just come join us on stage if you dare. So I think, let me first, hello, there you are. This is a bit awkward because we can't really see you, but I will just quickly tell you about our panel. So I've titled the panel Urgent Policy Questions to Advance Flexible and Alternative Learning Pathways. You will notice that we are here today to ask a lot of questions and maybe a few answers, but we didn't promise it, so we'll see what happens at the end. So we'll be kind of asking for our main question: how can globally interoperable digital credentials in education be achieved? That's hard enough. And which policy actions are necessary to achieve international standards and recognition? Perhaps we'll start with the quick introductory round. I will let Koen start and then Udbhav after that.
Yeah, hello. Quick introductory round. Okay, I gave an extensive presentation, I think, on the work that we are doing. So I'm Koen Nomden. I'm working in DG Employment of the European Commission in the Skills Agenda Unit. And within the Skills Agenda Unit, I'm in charge of a team that deals with skills transparencies and also qualifications transparency. And among the core activities of my team in particular are the European qualifications framework, which we administer from the European level, but which of course entails cooperation with the national level, because the national frameworks are managed by the member states, but they are related to and they have been connected with the European qualifications framework. Target there is transparency, comparability of qualifications based on learning outcomes. If not, you can't do it, obviously. We also work on validation of non-formal and informal learning, which is a key component, of course, of lifelong learning. And there is also there again a recommendation, a European recommendation for it. Then my team works on the European digital credentials for learning, so an infrastructure that allows to issue, to store, to share, to verify digital credentials in the field of learning. And we also have developed the European learning model as underpinning data structure for the work that we are doing. Now, EDC's European Digital Credentials for Learning can be used either directly on the platform, which is the Europass platform, but also the software can be used on local systems, and in that case the standards are used. These credentials are tamper-proof and in line with W3C international standards of verifiable credentials. And also, I mean, important in this context is the support to, for example, recognition of qualifications, because digital credentials provide an awful lot of transparency, and of course also their authentication. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to you, Udbhav.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Udbhav Tiwari, the head of global product policy at the Mozilla Corporation. I'm very sorry that I'm not there in person. Like, some things just happened yesterday that meant that I couldn't be there, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Within the public policy team at Mozilla, we tend to work on a variety of issues around the world, and within the broader sort of category of data governance and data protection, digital ID is one of the areas where we've done a fair bit of work. And my primary perspective coming into this conversation, both I think within the context of the European Union, but also in the context of international recognition, will primarily be centered around data protection, privacy. What are some of the technical trade-offs and that one sometimes has to make in between balancing privacy of users and individuals, especially when they come from different legal frameworks, as well as making sure that the information that are present in credentials can be easily accessed. In particular, some of the work that we've done in Mozilla, and there's this white paper that I'd encourage for you to look up. It's called Openness in Digital Identity, where we take some of the lessons that we've learned from developing one of the most popular open source projects in the world, the Mozilla Firefox web browser, and bringing it and applying the principles from that to the digital ID domain. And many of the principles that we mentioned there are certainly principles that we think even in the field of educational credentials could be quite useful in terms of the design and development of some of these programs, but also how the multiple stakeholders that are involved in this debate are consulted as a part of that process. But with that short overview, over to you, Kathleen.
Perfect. We'll switch from the virtual world to the physical. Do you feel very immaterial over there? No. Go ahead, Meg.
Hi. Okay, Meg Wenger. I work with a private credential evaluation agency in the U.S. As related to some of the topics today, as credential evaluators, we both send and receive data. So we have to find ways to receive and to process credentials of all kinds, and then to also issue an evaluation afterwards. So that's sort of interest. I also, I think that universities in the States in particular are struggling with non-traditional credentials. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I also, one of the things I did recently was work with a small college in Milwaukee, where I live, who are in the process of developing micro-credentials. And they wanted to get sort of an international perspective on it, so I worked with them on that, and it was a really interesting process because of who they brought into the conversation, the questions they asked, all those kinds of things. So that sort of helps inform my perspective on this topic.
Thank you. Thomas. I think you just speak.
Actually, I'm just an avatar, not really a person. Okay. In 2010, early days, I guess it was of the Obama administration, they decided that 60% of those who had completed their school-level education should go on to obtain some sort of further education and training or a university credential. And we discovered that there were lots of people getting things that were not university degrees, but we had no idea how to count them. We had no idea who was getting them. We had no idea whether they were worth getting, whether they actually led to further advancement in schooling or better employment outcomes. And so my first encounter with these sort of non-degree credentials, these alternative credentials, came in that setting. I'm proud to say, or rather sad to say, I think we still have a very fragile idea of these things, right? This is a bit of the sort of dark matter in the universe, and trying to understand what these things are and establish a common nomenclature, and then understand the deeper questions about who's getting these things and with what impact are they having on their educational trajectory and their employment outcomes, are still questions that we struggle to answer. At the OECD, where I work,
thank you for mentioning. I was about to say.
Yeah,
but Thomas is head of the higher education policy team at the OECD.
The OECD is an intergovernmental organization of 38 countries, soon to be 43. We work with ministries of education, and we took it upon ourselves. I think, initially, to start doing some analysis of so-called alternative credentials. We couldn't even figure out what language to use, but we were certain that ministries of education were a bit sleepy. Sorry, I can sit. And that universities were not necessarily consistently paying attention to this emerging landscape of new ways of acquiring and recognizing learning. But we were sure that they should be paying attention to this because this would start to have an impact on them. Either this is going to be complementary to what they do in traditional degree studies, right? And these could be things that LinkedIn is doing or that Google is doing with its certificates, right? But we were certain that these were going to either be start to become substitutes in part for what they do or complementary to what they do, and they should really start to understand that. Since that time, we've been working with our good friends at the European Commission, doing an analysis of particularly focusing in a more limited way on micro-credentials to support the Council's recommendation, looking at the development of those across the OECD. Who's offering them, who's taking them up, what do they consist of, and how are they working, and what sort of policy problems are there. And we continue to work because one of the problems that is emerging as countries try to move forward and put some sort of policy framework around these new things, around these micro-credentials, there are basic questions to be answered. For example, should we as governments be paying for learners to acquire micro-credentials? Well, maybe, but what is the right way in which we should finance that? How should we finance the providers of that? We can't spend any money on that unless we have some assurance of the quality of those things. How do we assure the quality of these? Because we've never done anything like that before. And can we actually see that these are leading to an educational progression? And what kind of labor market outcomes are people experiencing when they acquire these credentials? Since none of our labor force information systems actually capture and track what's happening here. So sort of working with governments to help them build policies sufficient to support high-quality micro-credentials learning is what we're doing now in partnership with the European Commission.
Thank you. Maybe we can pass, when we're talking about labor market outcomes, maybe that's a good bridge to Rolf.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rolf Reinhardt. I do work for LinkedIn. The title goes Senior Account Director, and to translate that into what I'm actually doing, I'm doing consultancy and also selling solutions for organizations like intergovernmental organizations, the UN agencies from UNESCO in Paris to World Food Programme in Rome and so on. And they have particular questions, and these questions maybe also you have in your organization or you try to tackle for the society. It's first of all to think about what talent do we actually need, maybe in 5 years. So where are we heading towards? Then the second question is, do we have that talent? Can we build an inventory of skills? Can these skills be verified? And then the question is, what would be the potential avenue to go? Do we invest in upskilling? Do we do reskilling? Do we potentially hire people? And if yes, from where? So where are the talent pools and where is the labor? Big question, of course, for us in our Western society when we look into industries such as nursing and so on, and into craft work. So this is then what I'm doing with these organizations, and it goes from then, deciding about the path, then eventually going down the road, and also thinking about how we can engage our employees further. And engagement is related to providing continuous learning opportunities, but not only learning opportunities in a kind of an empty shell, but also looking how to give them earning opportunities, and how to eventually give them the chance to progress towards a certain occupation or position, both internal, which is maybe in theory at least easier, but then also external, where the question of course, credentials and exporting functionalities out of silos become more important. And then just very shortly, I'm also working at an organization, it's an association called International Council on Badges and Credentials. And there I have the title concierge, which is basically the guy who stands at a reception and then someone comes along and says, can you offer me this? And I say, yes, go upstairs to room 3. Or I say, no, we can't, but I might know someone who you should talk to, go down the road and visit that person. And that's maybe also the reason why I'm here. So looking at you, very smart people and even smarter fellow panelists, I might have not so much to contribute today, but a lot to learn and maybe also to direct people later on, which I look very much forward to. Thank you.
I would really have to disagree. A concierge is always the person who knows everything. So we will see. Yes, So we've been throwing a lot of terms about alternative learning pathways, flexible learning. I thought maybe I could kind of go through my view of what policy developments we've had in the past decade and what terms we're talking about, and then we can open the discussion. So I think we've seen kind of 5 significant areas of development within digital credentialing. So for one, establishment of the term lifelong learning in all of its various meanings. So with the move away from a norm of formal restricted learning and acceptance of the need for more diverse approaches, also within reskilling, for example. Then we also have the general adoption of outcomes and competences as the basis for structuring curricula and qualifications for measuring achievement in a quality assured way. I think most people in this room know what I'm talking about. And also a growth in the uses of and demand for new qualifications. So meeting a demonstrable and policy-driven need for specific skills to provide progression into or through an international or local field of practice. And I'd also say that we have kind of the emergence of, and this is probably what we should talk about today, the emergence of sectoral, national and regional frameworks which place standard outcomes and qualifications in hierarchical relationships and advisory, regulatory or legislative structures. And then, as we're talking about credentials, I thought we could quickly go through the taxonomy, which captures different credentials characteristics. So credentials which offer evidence of experience or abilities which are not quality assured, so references, endorsements, records of membership, attendance and participation. Then credentials which offer indirect but reliable evidence of experience or abilities. Yes, I suppose so. So profiles based on outcome or statements which capture the main general or occupationally specific features of an individual's background. As I'm reading this, I'm also wondering how these precise differences. So we can tell we have some definition work to do. And then, of course, a buzzword of the day, credentials awarded for single short courses or a collection of short courses leading to a set of related outcomes. So module, unit, part qualifications. We call them micro-credentials, though there are also some differences to be made. We had the question about how many ECTS, does everything have to be part of the transfer system? And then credentials, which I would call full qualifications, awards, which are made on the basis of quality assured assessment, recognition as guarantees. So essentially a diploma of some type, macro credentials. And for today, I thought we should make, as we're talking about alternative learning pathways, I thought maybe we should not take macro credentials out of the pictures and talk more about the other qualifications I listed. So after that, I think we'll start with kind of an easier question to ease us in. So in your view, is there an understanding and use of these different types of credentials I just listed from the general public? Because I'm not always so sure, but I'm also not working in kind of a learning context, a university context. And then do you see any regional differences in their use and acceptance? And I thought maybe we could start with Rolf, who can maybe offer some insights on LinkedIn strategies on micro-credentials or different type. I'm not sure what they're called, but maybe you can tell me.
Exactly, yeah. So they are not called micro-credentials.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, first of all, so LinkedIn, I don't know if every one of you knows LinkedIn or who of you has a LinkedIn profile. Yeah, many of you. So you know there are a lot of people like you on LinkedIn. We've also heard there is some artificial intelligence on LinkedIn, faking profiles. But we do have over 870 million members on LinkedIn, and they provide us with data to fuel an engine which is very interesting because it's the employment engine and the search of the recruiters. And I'll just give you a little bit of an overview, you know, how that works. So initially, when you create a profile, you list your skills. And a lot of people are asking us, so what's the meaning then of an endorsement? And you know, there was once this movement, or still is, around the open recognition from Serge Reve and so on, looking into, you know, this is where actually the first value comes in. From a data point of view, at LinkedIn, we don't look so strongly anymore at the endorsement. We often, probably you at OECD, when we did a presentation there, you've never seen endorsement statistics because they are biased, okay? But what we have recently implemented, and this goes down to the credential question, what's the proof of your skill? What's the proficiency level? And that's a question that I get asked from the talent community a lot. You know, if you say you know project management, well, maybe you have heard about project management, you know the definition, but do you actually apply it? You know, have you experienced it in it and so on? So, and then we also look into issuing credentials for our course, LinkedIn Learning course. There are over 18,000 courses in more than 20 languages, whatever. And these courses are partially also curated, and there are higher level credentials that even you can exchange into credentials from universities and get ECTS credits from. And there what we do is exactly what you're doing, and I find it's like super interesting also the profession as such, because they look into what's the learning hour, you know, that you invested into that course, which is something that we can provide. I mean, you know, like you have, but we don't know if you have really watched that and so on. So, and then what Koen has said before, the learning outcome, this is where the higher education organization then come into place. They need to verify, is there like an educational outcome? Yeah, just very shortly, one last thing, I know, yeah, but I'm really curious to hear what you're saying. I can't wait, but one last sentence I have to say, because there is something around these boot camps and, you know, like tailored programs from Google and so on. And also Microsoft is the mother company, so to say, or the mothership of LinkedIn, and they have like a global skills initiative, you know, so where you can attend like free courses, also from LinkedIn Learning, so playlists or learning pathways that end with a career essential certificate. And now, of course, and I'm looking forward to discuss that very controversially, because you could say, so what's the value of such a career essential certificate? So, and then from a societal point of view, we also have to ask ourselves, can we neglect that there are such certificates, particularly for occupation profiles that are very much sought after in a world where lifelong learning becomes the imperative, you know, and where we have actually the need of also an aging workforce to know such skills. So, I mean, they don't maybe need to know how to do software engineering, but they need to know how to code. On that note, still looking very young, but what do you think about?
Well, I was just going to jump in when you mentioned like the unreliability, of course, of the endorsements as a basis, and how do you know someone's a good project manager? And one answer to that question is there is something like the Project Management Institute, which exists globally, right? And it has a set curriculum that learners follow, and it has an assessment that it administers, right? And so you get, I mean, the beauty is with the industry and sector, you know, the firm and industry and sectoral qualifications that have emerged, of course, many of them in IT, whether that's Cisco or Microsoft, but also in other fields as well, like in project management and in some other areas. It's so much, in a sense, easier to do because you're looking at a smaller skill bundle rather than something that's global. You're looking at a provision. Microsoft, they have a standard curriculum, right? And they administer that same curriculum, in a sense, to learners. And they have a standard assessment. And if you can administer that in a controlled test setting, right? And there are many of those available to learners, then you have a high level of confidence and you can make a good prediction about the skill level of the person who holds that.
It's known.
It's known. So it's a problem of trust and understanding that is solved through that sort of standardization, right? And then universities, I mean, certainly around the world, there are universities that express willingness to embed these. Some, no, no, but there are. I mean, there are universities that will take, you know, the University of London is taking Google, you know, user experience certificates and saying that counts for this number of ECTS inside of your curriculum. So there's an interesting relationship and economy that's emerging there, but it's really easy to do that on those islands. Those are islands of trust built on a shared curriculum and shared assessment, right? That's where it's most advanced, but it has a very strong bias in terms of industries and social class, right? So it's not very inclusive.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, Kathleen had said, can you give the U.S. perspective? And I'm like, in one word, decentralization is the U.S. perspective. And I think that the Google, the Cisco, some of those have the cachet of the name behind them. So if someone wants to get a job and says, oh, you know, I have a Google certificate in XYZ, the employer probably knows what they're talking about. But typically, U.S. institutions have just been dragged into this kicking and screaming, to be honest. They don't want to have to deal with it, but they realize now that they do have to deal with it. So they have to not only consume these credentials, but create their own, which is another whole issue. When they can't agree on definitions, they can't agree on quality assurance, they can't agree on any number of things. And so then the university says, okay, we're going to create some and we're going to define them ourselves because there are no standard definitions. So ideally, right, the perfect micro-credential will be stackable from a university perspective, quality assured, and transparent so that industry, employer, universities, everybody knows what they're talking about. But then that leads to who sets the standards? Who does the quality assurance? Because in the States, there's so much competition among stakeholders. You know, universities would say, we set the standards. Industry would say, we set the standards. Somebody might ask the students and say, we'll tell you what we need. Right now, it's very rare for a micro-credential to be tied to any sort of weight, like, you know, U.S. credits, semester hours of credit, for example. So it usually is incumbent upon the recipient, the university that's looking at this credential to say, oh, this seems like this is about equal to, you know, Intro 101 and Intro 102, so we'll give you credit for that. And it's so every institution is having to figure out for themselves with very little agreement on what we're looking at. So that's really, you know, ideally there are standards and there's stackability and all those things, but boy, it's not there yet.
I want to shamelessly plug our work at the OECD.
Yeah.
And we have actually taken a look within institutions, within university systems, and across countries at how they, for example, how big a chunk of learning, how many ECTS are associated with this. So if you, we have a series of reports out and you can look and see kind of what's going on across the world. So we have sort of aggregated some information. Of course, the answer is it's all over the place, right? I mean, in New Zealand, right, the ISKID level, it's an international taxonomy of study level. It's at the sort of upper secondary school level that micro-credentials are being awarded. Many of them are tied to trades and crafts, and they carry a very, very tiny number of ECTS. And then in other countries we see, in Ireland, it looks completely different to that, right? So there's a huge variation. It's not a stabilized field of practice. But if you think about the bachelor degree, how long did it take for the world to standardize something like the bachelor degree? It's not probably quite fully standardized now, and it's only been around for a few hundred years. So I mean, it's a slow and steady work. And maybe the other question, and I've had this discussion with the Commission, which is you don't want to create. There is an incredible creativity in this non-degree space. There's lots of innovation taking place. Partnerships between universities and technology firms, and universities are creating things. And it's part of the creativity derives from the fact that it's taking place outside of the existing legal frameworks, really, in most systems. And it's been an incredible creativity. So, I mean, you want to get the balance between sort of risk and reward and innovation right. Maybe I mean, one of the good things is many of the micro-credentials are relatively brief, and they're either free or at a low cost. And if you think about risk-based regulation, you would say you don't want to put too heavy a hand on it and use the traditional forms of quality control that are used for medical degrees, for micro-credentials, because they're actually at a fairly low risk to learners. And you want to not sort of make it too heavy. And some countries, we've had experiences with some countries that have tried to make micro-credentials or these alternative credentials fit inside their traditional forms of quality assurance, right? And it has strangled them because that's a very heavy procedure, right? What you want to assure for a master's degree in civil engineering is very different than what you want to have as a quality protection around some hours of learning that are recognized in one of these other credentials.
Thank you. I think, what did you say, great chaos or something? And we always call it dealing with existing complexities. But I think that's absolutely true for the policy field on a local, national, institutional and international level. We haven't forgotten that our policy experts are sitting behind us. So I thought maybe this would be a good time for you to chime in. If you'd like to comment on anything you've heard, please go ahead. But also maybe you could give us a short view of kind of what Mozilla's own role in the field is, or if there's any specific policy actions that you're working towards. And of course, from the European Commission, kind of the value of standard setting and maybe a short roundup.
Sure, thank you. Very happy to come in. I think the conversation so far has been very fascinating, right? Because in the way that we've tended to look at digital credentials at Mozilla because of a part of our work, and for a little more context, while Mozilla is most known for its Firefox web browser, it's unique in that the Mozilla Corporation is under the Mozilla Foundation, and the Mozilla Foundation has a much broader mandate on the kind of issues that it works on. And in general, they tend to extend well beyond the things that would directly just impact the Firefox browser in and of itself. And the primary reason that we've worked on digital identity in many countries around the world, in India, in Kenya, in Europe on the EIDs as well, has primarily been because of that broader focus of what role should digital credentials play in a society where they're clearly necessary, but where a lot of the issues around security, privacy, accessibility haven't necessarily been completely figured out. And with that broader lens, I would certainly say that our own work in the space broadly falls into three categories. One, and that's the one that I'm the least qualified to talk about, is we are fairly active members of W3C. I know a lot of the standardization work on a technical front that's happening, say with the the ELM framework, for example, is happening at the W3C, and that's something that I know that my colleagues on the technical side have kept an eye on and engaged on, especially from an XML sort of technical perspective. But apart from that, the other two areas I think that I'd like to really talk about are, one, generally deciding that apart from really creating the technical infrastructure that would allow international data sharing to take place in a reliable manner, also really accounting for some of the privacy and data protection concerns that this necessarily raises, because I think that the idea or the notion that privacy and data protection are universal sort of rights is one that is not necessarily present everywhere around the world, right? For example, the United States of America doesn't yet have a federal privacy law. India is still debating its federal privacy law and doesn't really have one yet. And thanks to some of, I think, those developments, the idea that just because credentials exist in a certain jurisdiction, of course, this is after we have figured out what those credentials would look like, what are the kinds of information that you would like to include in them. The idea of when would we allow individuals or organizations or universities to be able to request access to them? How would we say that the threshold for consent has necessarily been met before that credential could be shipped, sometimes outside the borders of the territory where they've originally been issued? In case something goes wrong, what is the process that would be set in place in order to remedy that process? These are questions that I think even for many parts of the technology sector are still very much wide open questions. Europe with the GDPR, I think, has over the last 3 to 4 years brought many of these issues to the fore, where things like data localization in certain countries or the free flow of cross-border data are ways in which these debates are playing out, I think, at the first principle level. But it's clearly something that, as things trickle down, will have a very big impact on the educational credential market as well, especially because when it comes to things like immigration, a lot of the reasons that people move between countries and say immigrate in and out of certain jurisdictions is on the basis of demand for certain skills and being able to prove that, they have those skills as well. And I mean, I can use my own example, right? Like I moved to Germany from India, like maybe about a year ago, approximately. And at the time that I had to do that, when I applied for my own blue card visa, I had to prove that the credentials that I had earned in India were actually credentials that were recognized in Germany. And the proof that I had to give ultimately to the embassy in New Delhi in India were 2 printouts from the page of the agency in Germany that certifies that my degree is recognized and says this is what it's equivalent to, and the second, another printout of the fact that the university is one that is recognized. And then after that, the embassy sort of went onto that website, checked my actual certificate, which I had to submit an original copy of, and then they verified whether this, like this information is actually true, and then they issued the visa to me. So as you can imagine, the existence of digital credentials would have made this a very different process, arguably a much quicker process, but also a process which would be far less susceptible, to like either deception or fraud or other kinds of things that could happen where a lot of this work is necessarily happening on the paper, like in paper, essentially, in many of these actual conversations. So for all of that, I think that thinking through ways in which like after what comes after credentials, like imagine that we do agree how they should actually look like, how will we share them, who will we share them with, will there be adequacy agreements, will we connect them to digital identity programs, and things like that are questions that I think that validly need to be considered, and some of the answers to them are not really, I think, even for issues where people have been studying them for much longer, very readily available. And the second bit that I wanted to talk about was broadly digital ID, right? Because right now we've focused on the credentials aspect, but I'd like to use an example from India of something called it's called the National Academic Depository, right? And what that does is that it every time, say you go to a university, and right now it's only available to universities and sort of formal educational qualifications, you submit your digital ID number in India, which is the Aadhaar, alongside that qualification, and the university, when it issues a credential to you, of course, issues that paper credential, but it also issues a credential that is stored digitally in a repository that's run by the Ministry of Education at the central level in New Delhi in India. And if, say, your employer wants to verify that, like there is another service that operates in India called Digital Locker or DigiLocker, where they can actually ask for your credentials, and when they ask for those credentials, they're actually sent not from you to them, but from that National Academic Depository to that to the entity that is requesting that. And that makes, as you can imagine, things like verification quite different. It also means that in a way it's directly coming from the university, which of course people sort of do right now, where they sign up for services that can deal with electronic credentials that pay as well. But the fact that there is one single centralized repository at a country level, especially for a country like India that has, I think, many of the both availability of internet and things like that as issues, it's a pretty, I think, interesting model. But there are many risks that then start coming about with digital ID programs in general, right? The idea that similar to your tax ID or to your passport number, that your education credentials and essentially various aspects of your life are being associated with a single identifier poses some very serious privacy and security risks, and especially if it is made mandatory, then there have even in India been constitutional challenges for whether that is something that should or should not exist. And I think Europe is also considering within the eIDAS framework, in the way that the regulations are being updated, a notional idea of at least of if there were credentials to exist for things like diplomas or educational credentials, how would they work in practice? And I think the concept of the digital wallet that exists in the European eIDAS regulation is a pretty interesting one, also very similar to the DigiLocker concept that I just explained in India as well. So on that front too, I think that there are, from a service provider perspective, a lot of benefits, in ways, depending on how the digital ID system is implemented, the kinds of fraud that can take place decrease a lot, because your name, your date of birth, and a lot of this information ends up coming from a digitally issued ID document by a national member state, and you like compare and contrast that to the diploma document, and therefore you can, be more sure of it than at least in some of the other verification systems that people have used in practice. But that, like, whether that should be made mandatory, what are the ways in which maybe some of that credential matching can happen without necessarily sharing information with the service provider itself. So for example,
No examples. Thank you so much. Actually, thank you for so many examples. I think that was really great and also important for us to hear your own personal experience, and also, for example, the question of how is data collected via, for example, National Student Clearinghouse or something that is kind of contrary to a lot of political concepts that put the learner at the center. But I'm sure, and you also mentioned the European learning model, so I'm sure Koen would like to jump in and comment.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen, and thank you also, dear colleagues, panelists, because I really enjoyed your contributions. There are just a few things that I would like to also throw, in the discussion. First of all, a key element here is that there is a need for skills identification and skills documentation already, because not every person is aware of the skills that they have. And this is quite an important task. And for this also, we have this policy and this principle of validation of skills that actually we would like all EU member states to embrace. There is the recommendation for it. And this is an element that is a key element in any skills strategy. And the OECD also is carrying out skills strategies. So they make analysis of the national landscape, and then they come with some proposals how to do things better. And we help countries when they want to undergo such skills analysis, skill strategy by the OECD. And also secondly, whatever learning is taking place, whether it's Microsoft or Google or formal education training, non-formal, but also if you want to make visible your skills acquired just in your free time, I mean, learning should be made visible. Should be made visible, because only in that way it can be put to use for personal reasons or for labor market reasons. Now we see that countries, I cannot speak about the global level, but at least within Europe, countries look at things in different ways. In some countries, it's much more accepted to validate skills than in others. Some countries have much more formal approaches and formal viewpoints on education, training, what you should have learned than other countries. Now, when we talk about all of this and micro credentials, and that is maybe a bit more at the top end sometimes as well, one of the issues we need to ask ourselves is, what is the public task and what is not a public task? And in this context, the public task is, of course, also to have responsibility for social inclusion. In all of this, nobody should be left behind. And I was saying I'm working in the DG for employment, but it's at the same time the DG for social inclusion of the European Commission. This is a key issue, and we need everybody on board, and especially in current labor markets with skill shortages. Now, regarding perhaps some elements of where standards would be set, so the European approach on micro-credentials initiative was indeed an initiative, and Thomas contributed to this study on alternative credentials that was also really used as an input to that work. That those standards, and I showed them in my presentation, are there, but it is not so easy to agree with 27 member states about what these standards should be. So we basically agreed in that recommendation on standard elements that should be present in micro-credentials. That's the European approach. But for example, there was no agreement on for example, what the volume should be, because the volumes are really different. And when we look at quality assurance, there are many different approaches. I also observed that indeed the higher education world is always a bit wary of quality assurance approaches outside the formal domain. But okay, I think quality assurance should be proportional and it should be transparent. then indeed the European learning model has been an effort, to also support interoperability very much by, in particular, the semantic interoperability, because in the end, what is important, and that's why we work on this in the European context, is that, individuals, when they are in a particular country, they should also be able to move to another country with their credentials, as you have been doing, Udbhav, as you said, and I was interested to hear that you came on a blue card, which is also a European initiative as a directive. Standards, we believe, are useful for interoperability, and in the end, to the benefit of learners and workers. But key message is also nobody should be left behind.
Thank you. So before we open the conversation to the audience, I'm sure you have questions you'd like to pose as well. I thought maybe we could do a quick round of kind of, how would you say that your current institutional policies for whichever institution or have the capacity to reflect alternative learning pathways? And do you have any kind of great examples that we should all adapt? And you can answer this question in whatever way you see fit. I realize that, of course, the institutional context, but I think it's good to start with the concrete question, and then we'll go ahead.
So this is kind of my closing statement, so I had a couple thoughts. Initially, these micro-credentials, the QA was in the doing, right? Like people would say, I have a micro-credential in some sort of desktop publishing, and the employer would say, okay, that's fine, but you still have to do the job. And so we've evolved past that. I think, as you mentioned, New Zealand, that's the gold standard, right? Because they've got a very well-defined national qualification framework. They've tied every single credential you can think of to it, and there's a great deal of fluidity. You don't have to start in formal credentials, and you can move into formal credentials. Having said that, they're a tiny country with many fewer institutions and providers, so it was, it was made more possible for them. So the U.S. does not have an NQF. However, we have a task force put together that's in the process of developing it, because we felt that the only way that we can even, national versus international is not the issue. It's like we can't even tie national credentials to anything without having an NQF. So we're starting there. Then when we see international credentials, we'll say, okay, this fits here on the NQF. And this is worth this amount of credits or whatever. So that to me is a starting point, because it's a sort of mutually agreed upon standard. In the US, you kind of need to build a coalition of stakeholders. So National Student Clearinghouse, some of the other ones that, if we get them on board, then we can move it forward. The only other thing that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned, there's too many technical standards. That's a hurdle. We need to figure out a better way to have the technological issues solved, and then we can work on some of the other things. Right now, that's part of the problem. And I also think we absolutely need to have more engagement and cooperation with underrepresented regions and populations. This has really been a north-north conversation. It needs to become a north-south conversation as well. What do some of the nations in the global south want from this whole process? I think we have to develop good practices to share amongst ourselves, and that will work for all stakeholders. Traditional pathways are shrinking, in the US in particular. So there needs to be a better way to make educational, sort of advancement available to everybody. We need to think about transferring the ownership from the provider to the learner. I think that's really key. And in a decentralized system, how do we make all this work in the context of a decentralized system? So that's kind of my final word.
Thank you very much. Any best practices, Thomas?
The best practices are easy on the technical side. I'm struck by the way we're dealing with two problems.
I agree, but the only people that say the technical side is easy are policy makers. But yes, continue.
No, I mean, but I've also done a lot of data exchange in my life, right? Like, if you say, oh, I know, let's put this in XML format and let's have our layout this way, and you supply me with these metadata, like, okay, those are solvable problems, right? But going back to the earlier presentation today about fascinating discussion about sort of trust, yeah? I mean, we're talking at the same time about this digital transformation, but we're talking about we've got completely new ways we're trying to organize and recognize learning, which is a separate issue, right? So we're trying to recognize the skills that people have, and we're trying to recognize those in ways that they've acquired them outside of some traditional structures of learning, right? And to figure out how, when someone shows up with a digital record or any kind of record, frankly, it doesn't matter whether it's paper or digital, I mean, understanding what skills are associated with that thing they're presenting you and trusting that they actually have those skills, that's really hard, right? And that's a work in progress. We've got some ways to go. As I said earlier, I think that small bundles of skills against the standard curriculum and assessment are pretty easy, but it's really, really hard, and we've got a long journey ahead of us there.
Yeah, so I mean, trust essentially is at the heart and essence of everything. And I mean, I'm really like always amazed when I see the presentations from the European Commission and from the OECD, and there's really a lot of, you know, like brain essence in these documents, and a lot of people have discussed about it, and eventually the papers got longer and longer and longer, which is great, you know, because eventually maybe we will all end up where you are. But I guess that the danger is that on that track where you are already super advanced, you're losing the rest of us. And my message to you would be maybe to start small. And so there's this Philip Long from the T3 network, and he defined this terms of the mini ecosystems. And you named New Zealand as an example and said it was easy to realize because it's a small country and people knew each other potentially, or they trusted each other. And within the network of trust, you can exchange credentials, and it's maybe not as important to, you know, first have all the details mapped out, because gradually you will evolve in the process. And you asked about LinkedIn. I mean, I spare you like our internal practices, but eventually at LinkedIn, between a member who looks for a job and a recruiter who looks for a potential talent, there is also a trust negotiation. And of course, sometimes it's stimulated or enhanced by technology, for example, through a matching algorithm. If there are on a job slot, an open job, too many applicants, you can insert, for example, you need to have that credential, show me that credential, otherwise you can't process, and I would not even have a look at your presentation. But then my very last point I wanted to make is about not inclusion, but about equity. And I've seen recently a picture which was really interesting to me about what's the definition of equity. And it was, you know, like 3 people of different sizes looking over a fence. And the inclusive part would be treating them like equal, giving them everyone one box, you know, but they would be still of different sizes. And this giving everyone one box is basically what technology often is doing. Whereas we as humans, we need to look at what mistakes can be made at scale. So for example, through AI, algorithms, and etc. And a very last anecdote, if I may, about LinkedIn. LinkedIn was created to make the world a better place. Then we realized that we actually use the traditional connections that people had. In German we call it Seilschaften, so the people who climb on a hill with their rope, and they're tied on a rope together, so they know each other, they pull each other, you know, from position to position. So we made that virtual, and eventually our CEO said, we as employees need to be first of all aware of that. We need to work on it, on the technology to become more inclusive, but of course also we need to reach out to people who are not in our network, because they need to be a part of the conversation as well. For example, people from Africa, etc. And that's why social impact programs are so important, and also some of the logos here, what they are doing, Karen, etc. I have the utmost respect for them, and they have to be supported. Thank you.
Thank you. Koen, go ahead.
Yes.
Last statement.
Yeah, thanks. I will be short, but I also have to leave for another meeting, unfortunately. No, I mean, I would say keywords are really trust and transparency. Transparency of skills, transparency of qualification is really a very important key. So that requires a learning outcome approach, and this is also underpinning, I think, qualifications frameworks across the globe, as far as I know them: Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the European ones. And happy to note actually that also the US is starting thoughts about what can be done, because I think you have the same problem in the sense that, why do we have a European qualification framework at all, for example? Because we have a diversity of national education and training systems. So we try to find ways through reference frameworks that these different national systems can communicate with each other. And we could, I mean, also you have the African Global Qualifications Framework. A huge challenge to do that. Maybe we should start small, I don't know, but we have already quite advanced, I think, on the EQF. What is a key point, that are my last words in the panel, is also that in all these developments, there is a dialogue between all different parties that have stakes, governments, of course, but also labor market stakeholders, education and training stakeholders of all levels, vocational, general, higher education, also the NGO parts, but also very much the learners and the employer and employee organization. So it's really a common endeavor, because in the end, if you have a framework, for example, you all need to have trust in that framework, so that it is not just something that exists on paper, but really delivering for learners and workers and for society things. And sorry, I have to leave you, but thanks a lot for the interesting panel.
Thank you so much. We also have to leave, but I want to give Udbhav the moment to at least choose maybe 3 keywords that we should deliver on our next steps, because you can't see all the hungry participants waiting, but I can.
No, thank you. No, I mean, I think that if there were 3 keywords for me, they would be like participation. So making sure that decisions are made by everyone who's impacted, something that was already just covered. The second would be like privacy, and making sure that as these things are implemented, they don't end up impacting, like things either negatively or end up causing more harm than good. And the third is essentially like optionality or non-mandation, right? To make sure that as much as these systems exist, most of the problems that come from digitization come from when everyone is forced to digitize. So that as much as digitization should exist, there should always be ways and options for people to use offline approaches, even if they are more tedious and may more take time, but like that they should have the option or the ability to do that, so that they can choose to opt out of some of these things if they don't want to. But that's it.
So thank you so much to my distinguished panel. It's been really active and enlightening. We'll have to save any burning questions for lunch. And I just want to say thank you to our tape artists who've been slaving away in the corner while we've been chatting and drinking coffee, but I think it's really great to have them there. I'm not sure if you can see them. So thank you very much, and great panel.